All right, so I would like to introduce our moderator, Cynthia Anson. She is a native she's a Tucsonan, and her affiliation is with the University of Arizona and Native Seed Search, and she will go ahead and introduce the rest of the panel. Just an FYI, after this panel is lunchtime, but on your way out, if you're interested in the Wednesday Native Seed Search session, please sign up outside the door on your way to lunch, all right? Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. Immediately to my right is Neil Thopper. Many of you know Neil or know of him. He is a staff attorney with the Sustainable Economies Law Center in California, and he has been working for over a year on the issue of seed libraries and seed law, and has been very involved in the incident that occurred in Pennsylvania. Very glad to have you, Neil. And to his right is John Torgrimson, who's the Executive Director of Seed Savers Exchange, a not-for-profit. And John has worked in not-for-profit management here and abroad for many, many years, and he was heavily involved in the Minnesota Seed Library issue, and he will be talking some about that. And also has just been part of publishing a book called The Seed Garden, The Art and Practice of Seed Saving. It's just been out for 2 weeks, and I think there's a sample copy here. Am I right?
Yeah, somewhere there is.
And to John's right is really a very well-known specialist in agricultural law, of which there aren't too many in the U.S. And that is Neil Hamilton, who is a professor of law and director of the Agricultural Law Center at Drake University in Iowa. He has been teaching agricultural law for 34 years, enough time to see a great many changes, and he has been on the board of Seed Savers Exchange for over 20 years. So just so happy to have his knowledge and experience contributed to us today. And the final panelist is Jacob Keary-Moreland, who is one of our international participants. He comes to Tucson from Toronto, Canada, and he is with a not-for-profit called the Seed Library Commons there. You heard, I think, Rebecca say how many seed libraries there are in the Toronto area, and Jacob's Seed Library Commons is a support group and technical support, I think, to seed libraries. So those are our panelists, and we're going to start off with Neil Thopper sketching in for you the regulatory framework here in the United States for seed law, both at the federal level and the state level. And then he will talk a bit about the seed library incident in Pennsylvania.
Okay, thanks. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. Well, it's really nice to be here and get to meet so many of the people that I've been working with over the last year in person, who I've been just on the phone with or emailing. So it's great to be here with all of you, and I want to thank everyone for organizing, who was part of organizing this. So that's me. So just first a little background about me and where I work. I work at the Sustainable Economies Law Center, which is a legal nonprofit based in Oakland, California, started about 5 years ago co-founded by Janelle Orsi, who was an attorney and was practicing in, at the time, what was called, really didn't have a name, but she made up a name, called herself the sharing lawyer. And she was practicing law in the sharing economy, which now is a term that I think is much more common and people are familiar with. But it was all about transitioning away from kind of the current economy that's mostly extractive to one that's regenerative. And so we call ourselves an organization that is transitioning towards a more just and resilient economy. And so in the food system, that means transitioning to a more local food system one that serves to feed us and to provide for community's needs. And so when we found out about what happened in Pennsylvania, which I'll talk briefly about last year, it fit right in line with what our mission was, and my own personal passion for sustainable agriculture and the importance of diversity in seeds made it a perfect fit for me to take on this role and to support seed libraries and this movement. So let's talk about what the problem was. And I think Rebecca had this on her slide. Janelle's also our cartoonist in chief, so she drew this cartoon. But how many of you are familiar with kind of the state seed law application or read something about what happened last year over the board? Okay, most people. Okay, so I'll make this brief. So essentially in June of 2014, there's a library in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, the Simpson Seed Library. Is anybody from Pennsylvania here? Hi. Are you from the Simpson Seed Library?
I live here now.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, they had just opened their seed library, basically part of their Earth Day celebrations for 2014, and were sent a letter from the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture saying that their seed library was out of compliance with the state seed law. I don't think many people even knew that there were state seed laws. I certainly didn't know that there were state seed laws at the time. Maybe Neil was probably one of the only few people who did know. And they were told that they were essentially a distributor under the definition of what it meant to distribute seed in the seed law. And because of that, they needed to comply with the regulations around labeling, which includes germination testing and permitting and the like. And so in order to comply with that, however, it would mean that the seed library would need to send seed samples to a lab to have them tested, which if you're a seed company, it's not a problem, it's par for the course, but if you're a seed library, you can't send 400 seeds to a seed lab, you'll deplete your seed stock. And it costs money, and as many of you know, because you operate seed libraries, this is not something that you do and you make a living off of necessarily. It's mostly a volunteer activity. So, and then there's permitting requirements and basically a whole list of requirements that apply to seed companies that were being interpreted to apply to seed libraries. And so there are two problems with that. There's one which is more of a philosophical question of should seed laws apply? But more immediately, what we found out when we started researching this is, well, legally, do seed laws apply to seed libraries? And in the case of Pennsylvania, the way that we interpreted it, we found that there was a misinterpretation of the law itself and who it applied to. And so then we started doing research into other state seed laws, and we found that the definitions around what it means to sell or what it means to distribute seed vary among all 50 states. There's seed laws in all 50 states, including there's a federal seed law as well. So let's look at what the Pennsylvania seed law says. But before that, we'll do a little bit of Con Law 101 here. Is anybody a lawyer or a law student? Or okay, all right.
Tell me whatever.
You don't need to be one to have some familiarity with these. But so there's a supremacy clause in the U.S. Constitution which says basically that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And out of that comes this doctrine of preemption, which essentially says that federal law trumps state law, which trumps municipal law. So there is a federal seed law that exists. It only regulates the interstate trade of seed. So in our case, that doesn't really apply to most seed libraries. And then there's this doctrine of federalism, which comes out of the 10th Amendment, which says that any power that's not enumerated to the federal government is reserved for the states. And so that's how you then get 50 state seed laws that regulate seed exchange and trade and now seed libraries, unfortunately, hopefully not soon, in states. So let's see what the Pennsylvania seed law says. It shall be unlawful to sell, offer for sale, expose for sale, or transport any seed unless. All of these things, which maybe you in the back can't you all can't read, but it's a lot of different things. A few to pick out, I mentioned before, is germination tests, lot numbers, name and amount of restricted noxious weed seeds, and if it's less than the standard germination rate, all of these extra things, and then a sell-by date. And this is pretty standard for any state seed law. This is kind of, you'll see why this is pretty standard in a few minutes. And so how many people who run seed libraries here are complying with all of this?
That's what you might sell.
Right. We take the position that seed libraries shouldn't have to, because these laws were intended not to regulate the giving away and the free sharing of seeds, which is what seed libraries do, but to regulate the commercial trade in seed. So this is, it's probably easy to understand why it's impractical in this room, but to kind of explain to the rest of the public that seed libraries are not going to be able to operate if we require them to do all of these things, and so this begs the question of should they apply, and we think they shouldn't. And jump in if you want to have a discussion at any point. I can go for a little bit longer.
Neil, it's important to say that to the extent the seed libraries are in fact just sharing packaged seed that they've obtained from other seed companies, they in fact may already be complying with many of these because they're just rehandling seeds that were in fact provided in compliance.
Yeah, that's a good point. So not only did we find out that in Pennsylvania and in some other states that the laws didn't apply, we also found out that the intent and the purpose, and we researched the legislative history of a lot of these laws and found out that the legislatures themselves never intended to apply these laws outside of the commercial context. And so I'll skip over that and come back to it in a second, but this is just pulled from the California's law itself. This is not even part of the legislative history, which is sort of just kind of preamble language. This is actually in the law itself. It says that the intent of this chapter is to enable the seed industry with the aid of the state to ensure that seed purchased by the consumer buyer is properly identified and of the quality and amount represented on the tag or label. So it's very clear in a lot of these laws that they were intended to regulate the commercial trade and essentially as a consumer protection statute for farmers, which makes a lot of sense if you think about farmers needing to buy seed and have seed that's of good quality. You'd want to have this standard so that people who rely on seeds for their livelihoods have access to good quality seed. That's not what necessarily seed libraries exist for yet. I think a lot of what Justine said about creating a consciousness around conservation and sustainability and saving seed and reintegrating that back into society is a lot of what seed libraries contribute, and not necessarily providing seed that people are going to rely on as the only source of income or food for themselves. So let me just go back to kind of compare a few different states' seed laws. There, a lot of this turns on the definition of sell or distribute, and so I just wanted to put up a few different examples of what sell means in different states. And so John will talk a little bit more about Minnesota, but in Minnesota there's a really expansive definition of sell in the statute that even includes exchange, distribution, or giving away of seeds. So technically in Minnesota, if you just give someone else seeds, you could be out of compliance with this law, and in fact, the seed regulator in Minnesota said as much. Not that they were going to enforce that, but that the technical language of the law included that. In Arizona and California, the language is the same, which includes exchange, barter, or trade. And I wanted to put sort of a contrast there, which is North Carolina. For whatever reason, I don't have the legislative history for North Carolina, but it's, it's not, you can't see it. Unfortunately, the key part, which is underlined, it says, the term distribute means to provide seed for seeding purposes to more than 5 persons, but shall not include seed used for charitable purposes. So if you live in North Carolina, you're probably in good shape. So anyways, that's just a sample of kind of what the seed laws say in different places.
Neil, I might
Yeah, please.
I want to add that for those of you who are from Arizona, we do have an Arizona seed law set forth in the revised statutes, and we also have rules and regulations about how to interpret that. If you want to know what it says, there's a very helpful 40-page booklet called the Arizona Seed Law and Seed Rules Reference Book. And it is available to anyone who wants it from the Seed Trade Association of Arizona, and their website is arizonaseedtrade.com. And that provision in most of the state seed laws that defines a dealer or a seller or whatever is generally interpreted very expansively, even if it doesn't include the words barter, exchange, transfer, distribute. I think that the trend has been to read those things into it. Mm. Would you agree, Neil, most places?
I think it varies. It varies on kind of who is charged with interpreting those laws. In some places, I think you have people who are keen to interpret them in broader expanses, and in other places people stick more to the letter of the law. So this is kind of a whirlwind tour of seed laws, state seed laws. So please, if there are questions, just a lot of things that I didn't say that I probably should have that you can bring out later on. But I want to talk just really quickly about a trade association which is called the American Association of Seed Control Officials that is really relevant to this discussion. And maybe some of you are familiar with them, maybe some not, but it's important to know who they are. So they were organized in 1949. Essentially, it's a trade association of seed control officials across the US and in Canada. It's a member-based organization, and there's one member from every state and one from Canada. And these are the people who are administering state seed laws. So in Minnesota, in Pennsylvania, where seed libraries have been visited by or inspected by regulators, it's these folks who are finding out about them and making those visits, or people who work for them who are making those visits. And they're charged with enforcing this law. And so this is their purpose, straight from their website, which is to discuss mutual problems and concerns relating to seed law enforcement and administration. And among the things that they do when they get together once every year at their annual meeting is to discuss Russell, which is the Recommended Uniform State Seed Law. So they drafted that and promote it, and every annual meeting will discuss revisions or additions or amendments to that model legislation. And that's their website, seedcontrol.org, which gives you a little insight into the way they perceive their role. And what is the Recommended Uniform State Seed Law? So this is really important. This is not a law that exists that has any authority or enforceability in and of itself. It's a model legislation. So if you've heard of ALEC or ALICE, these are organizations that develop model legislation and then distribute it out and promote it to state legislatures to apply. I'm not likening these to either of those, but I'm saying that this is an organization that creates model legislation and promotes it. And it's because they're a technical group who has expertise in this area, and so they get together and create the rules that they would want to see applied and that they would be able to enforce. So the reason it's important, essentially is just that it's very influential to state legislatures to see that there's a group that has technical expertise in a particular area that will create a set of rules that then they can adopt. And not every state has adopted it wholesale. Some have, some haven't, some have made changes. But anytime a state thinks to revise their own state seed law, they'll look to Russell whether or not they're going to actually take what's in it or not. They'll look to it to see whether there's something that they should adopt or change in their own state seed law. And it doesn't contain any provisions directly related to non-commercial seed sharing because it's not what they were thinking about. it's not something they're thinking about. So I kind of already talked about why it's important. And so then let me just say where we're at now. So we launched this campaign along with Seed Savers Exchange and Shareable and Richmond Grows and Seed Matters, a bunch of different organizations launched this campaign. And there's a petition online. We have 17,000 signatures supporting a petition essentially telling state regulators, the departments of agriculture, to accommodate seed libraries and to support seed libraries rather than restrict their activities. We've helped introduce legislation in 4 different states, or 3 states. One of them happened kind of rogue on their own, which is great, happening on their own. And at least one in Minnesota will hopefully become law this year, so it'll be essentially a model for other states to explicitly exempt seed sharing, non-commercial seed sharing, from application of the seed law so that this doesn't happen in the future. And there's something called the Seed Law Toolshed, which is an online resource that maybe some of you have seen, maybe not. But essentially it has excerpts of all 50 state seed laws and links to the actual text. So for Arizona, there's a link to what Cynthia mentioned. So it's on HackPad. If you just Google Seed Law Toolshed, it'll come up. The URL is kind of funky, so I didn't put it up here. And yeah, so there's more and more seed libraries. I had 350, and Rebecca said 400, so I changed it before I came up.
Yeah, 350 is in the United States, 450 international.
Worldwide, okay. 350.
Canada's here, since Canada's here, it's 400.
Okay, 400 is Canada's here.
401. Seed library.
And but yet, seed laws remain unclear in a lot of different states. We've only been able to work in a few states so far. And there's an upcoming meeting of ASCO, this nonprofit trade association, in July. And I looked at their agenda on Tuesday, and there's a panel on seed libraries and whether or not how they're going to affect state seed laws. So definitely it's something that has risen to the level of something that they feel they need to discuss because there's been so much support for seed libraries and they're growing so fast. So it's also really an important time for seed libraries to be engaged and people involved with seed libraries to make sure that they continue to be supported and continue to have an increasing role to play in this larger seed movement. So I think I'll...
Question.
Yeah.
Is there any way to find out who is this representative for our area that we could send an email to them or a letter?
Yeah. So on seedcontrol.org, there's a link to membership or roster or something like that, and it's by state.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So that's it for me for now. Should I pass it to John?
Yes. John's going to tell us more about the campaign in Minnesota that may end up resulting in some changes to the legislation.
Good morning. Everyone hear me? Okay. In November of 2014, the Duluth Seed Library found out that they were in violation of the Minnesota seed law. They'd been operating about a year by then. In fact, they got a lot of their starter seeds from Seed Savers, so we were a little bit interested when we found out that, in fact, they were being shut down. I was interested for a couple of reasons. One is because of the relationship to Seed Savers to the Duluth Seed Library, but also because I live in Minnesota and commute to Decorah, Iowa every day. So I found out that my own interpersonal seed saving and sharing was in violation of the seed law. So if I gave the seeds that I was saving at home and gave them to the 2 Neils or to Jacob, I would be violating the law. So I'm here today to tell you that my defense team is the 2 Neils, and to quote Spyro Agnew, if indicted, I'll not resign.
If convicted, you'll serve.
Yeah. As Neil has mentioned, the crux of the matter in Minnesota has to do with the wording of the definition of sell, and it's selling. It means the transferring of ownership, the offering and exposing for sale, exchange, distribution, giving away, having in possession with the intent to sell, exchange, distribute, give away. So there's really no distinction between seed libraries or interpersonal sharing. Basically, you cannot exchange or give away seeds, period. There's no distinction between whether it's commercial, hybrid, non-hybrid, patented seeds. It's all about the definition of cell. I got involved, as I said, because of I live in Minnesota, but also Seed Savers. So there was an interview on Minnesota Public Radio that kind of announced the fact that the Duluth Seed Library was being shut down, and I think Neil was part of that interview. So I called him out in California to find out what was going on from his end. He, in turn, connected me with several different organizations that were actively getting involved in Minnesota. I also called Stephen Malone at the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, who was the enforcement officer in the actual shutting down of the Duluth Seed Library. He, in turn, started inquiring about Seed Savers Exchange, had heard about us, knew what we were doing, and invited me to a seed advisory group meeting that they were going to have. I think it was in early December. I do want to take just a step back. Seed Savers does sell commercially about 600 varieties in our collection, just like Native Seed Search. I'm sure Ira can tell you a little bit about selling commercial seeds as well. And we comply with all 50 state seed laws. We do germ testing on all of our varieties that we sell publicly. We send off to Iowa State University about 400 samples of each variety. We have to meet certain thresholds, federal thresholds for germination, and they can range from like carrots, I think is 50% germination is the threshold versus tomatoes, I think is 70%. We spend about $15,000 a year on just germ testing. So just to give you an idea of what we need to do to be compliant to sell seeds commercially. So the onus on seed libraries having to do germ testing on the varieties that they're distributing is pretty onerous. I found out that there was really 4 key players in the process of getting the law changed in Minnesota. There's the legislators, obviously the lawmakers who create the law in the first place. There's the staff from the Department of Agriculture, who are the officers that are charged with enforcing and monitoring really the sale of commercial seed in the state. There are amateur gardeners like us, seed libraries, and other organizations that are very involved in the seed movement. And then there's also the commercial farmers and the seed associations that are affiliated with commercial farmers. All 4 of those players were part of this unfolding drama in Minnesota. In our case, I think there were several things that came together that really made a prime environment for both the legislature and Department of Agriculture officials being open to the idea of changing the law. First of all, we had a wronged party. Duluth Seed Library is just trying to do a good thing in a public way, and all of a sudden they're shut down. There was adverse media attention. There was the initial Minnesota Public Radio interview. There was an Associated Press reporter that I know interviewed me and several others. Mother Earth News came out with an editorial in their April-May issue talking about seed security and sovereignty. So there's a lot of media attention brought to bear. And by the time I was talking to Stephen Malone, you could tell that he was a little tired of having to answer calls from the media. Then of course, there was the different groups that were involved in organizing. You know, it's very difficult for the Duluth Seed Library to advocate on their own behalf, in the sense a lot of their resources and funding comes from public and other state official resources. And it was really important that other organizations come to work on their behalf. And there was probably about 8 to 10 really key organizations that got involved in Minnesota. And I think equally important was Neil and Selk's involvement to kind of take the glamour out of the seed law a little bit, for lack of a better word, to kind of debunk what is going on, to help organizations who probably don't use lawyers very often in their work, to kind of look at what is really going on and what is the problem. We had to get, right out of the box, Senator Roger Reinert, who was a Democrat from Duluth, came out in support of legislative action. The Duluth City Council came out with a resolution in support of the seed library. And so already there's activity going on in a legislative sense in Minnesota. The other thing is that the group that we were involved in met weekly. We communicated once a week to check on what's happening, who's doing what are the updates, is there anything that we need to look at and sort through. And during this entire process of getting the legislation changed, we met weekly just to make sure that we weren't missing anything, that something wasn't being missed. Basically right now, the omnibus agricultural bill in the Minnesota Senate and the Minnesota House contains the language that the seed law would exempt the interpersonal sharing of seed for home, educational, charitable, or personal non-commercial use. So it basically allows me as a resident of Minnesota to save and exchange seeds. It allows the Duluth Seed Library to facilitate the distribution of seeds. A couple of things that I think lessons learned. It was really essential that all the groups involved in fighting on behalf of the Duluth Seed Library have common goals. And right out of the box, it wasn't enough to just get an exemption for seed libraries. Because of the nature of the Minnesota law, we felt that our ultimate goal was to make sure that the interpersonal sharing of seeds was unregulated, that it was permissible activity. And Senator Roger Reinert's initial bill did not address that. So it was a little bit difficult for us to go back and say, do you mind changing your bill? Because he was so out in front, and there was a lot of publicity about him sponsoring this legislation. But we actually went to, some of the group went to a meeting with him and Minnesota Department of Ag officials, and he came back out with different wording on it. The other thing is that we met with, I was on both, well, you weren't, but Janine, is it Janine? Janelle from SELC and myself were on the phone, but there was groups meeting with Department of Ag officials and the Minnesota Seed Advisory Group to work out the actual wording that was brought into the legislation. So all four parties had to kind of win here. The lawmakers had to go away feeling that they're doing something really good. The Department of Ag officials had to go away feeling that this is an exemption that we feel is enforceable, that is good for agriculture in Minnesota. The organizations had to feel that we're getting what we set out to get. We're getting the law changed to interpersonal sharing. And the seed companies and the seed associations also had to kind of sign off. And these were groups that are the Wheat Growers Association and people like that who have a much more of a day-to-day relationship with the Department of Ag officials. And they had to basically say, well, this won't affect our operations in any way. It's really important to include them because we didn't want this to become a big ag, small ag kind of issue. In fact, they were their main concern was on the spread of noxious weeds. And it's almost, in Minnesota, it's almost a non-enforceable activity or law in that it's only handled on a complaint basis anyway. We seeded that. We didn't fight it, even though the likelihood that you're going to spread noxious weeds through a seed library is pretty remote. Let's see. It was really important, I think, for this too, that Neil and I not be the front of this fight with the Minnesota Department of Ag. We're outside organizations. I'm in Iowa, he's in California. It was really important that Minnesota organizations were up to bat to take this issue forward. It's also very important that you get bipartisan legislation. We had Senator Reinert in the Senate, DFLer. The Minnesota House is controlled by Republicans. So, DFL means Democratic Farm Labor, so it's a Democratic Party. And the House is controlled by the Republicans. So it's really important we find a champion in the House of Representatives as well. And we were fortunate to do that. So both houses were in support of this. The commissioner put it into the omnibus ag bill, and right now it's waiting passage. The legislature is still open for about 2 more weeks. I guess that I just want to close. You know, Jefferson was a seed saver. He joined a lot of seed exchanges, so we were pretty confident we had a founding father in our camp. You know, so we thought we could always, you know, pull that out when we needed it. But so anyway,
Great. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
I want to remind you, I'm Neil Hamilton, the second Neil, and first I want to thank Gary for a lifetime of inspiration and leadership, and for bringing all of us together, and thank Cynthia for the introduction, and thank all of you for the work that you're doing in terms of connecting people with seeds and gardening. And I also thank Neil and John for both their explanation and the work that they've done on this issue. You know, my role here is to provide a little bit of a historical or regulatory context from having taught agricultural law and written about many of these issues for 35 years. I was telling Cynthia, I went back and looked, and in fact in 1981 I wrote the chapter on state seed laws in the agricultural law treatise that one of my professors put out. And in 1991, I wrote an article called Who Owns Dinner? About evolving legal mechanisms for the ownership of plant genetic resources, which really deals more with the intellectual property rights issues. And so, you know, it's important to recognize, I think, that there are certainly potential regulatory issues here. And, but it's also important to, I think, put them into context and to frame the issues in ways, if possible, to try to avoid or minimize the possible legal doubts that might arise. And so, you know, first, from my perspective, certainly you know, I don't think that seed libraries threaten anyone in the seed trade, in the commercial seed trade. You know, the DuPont pioneers and the Monsantos of the world don't have seed libraries on their radar, I think, as one of the fish that they need necessarily to fry. And secondly, it's clear that seed laws weren't written with you in mind. I mean, when I look at this chapter I wrote 30 years ago, there's no real discussion of this idea of sale or of exchange or barter. I mean, it looks at how the terms basically commerce and selling were involved. Now, the fact that some state seed regulators have in fact questioned the work of seed libraries is certainly a reality. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that these enforcements, like many legal enforcements, are essentially discretionary on the part of the people, and that nobody is forcing someone's hand. It may well be a choice, and oftentimes an interpretive one. Which then, I think, brings a couple things in place. One is how seed regulators may see their job. And secondly, what is probably a lack of understanding or appreciation for what you're doing and why you're doing it, because it doesn't necessarily fit into the world that they're from. You know, first, as to their job, you know, state seed officials are regulators, and they find their counterparts in a number of other people sitting in the offices down the halls from them in the departments of agriculture, commercial feed, fertilizer, Pesticide Bureau, the Weights and Measures Bureau, right? Most state departments of agriculture are primarily regulatory as opposed to policy driven, right? Trying to create new opportunities for farmers or to connect people with food, though certainly, thankfully, there's some evolution in that regard. And so when it comes to, and all of these groups have their counterpart national organizations where they get together and talk about what they do and try to improve what they do, and in some situations try to expand their jurisdictional reach, which may well be natural because they're trying to justify their existence, oftentimes in a time of what might be shrinking state resources. You know, their goal is, as they would describe it, is to ensure the integrity of the seed industry, of commercial seed, protect buyers from unsafe products, protect farmers from buying seeds that aren't as they're labeled, that don't germinate, that contain noxious weed seeds of a certain level. And they do that, and so they regulate the commerce of seeds. And then the issue is, well, how do they do that in terms of the permitting requirements and labeling requirements and the type of things that John talked about. And so that is their primary mission. And so they're public servants, but their real audience isn't necessarily you, right? I mean, their real audience is the seed industry, right? The companies that they regulate, where they have a very close relationship. Not necessarily cozy in the sense that, you know, they're carving out exemptions for people, but close in that, okay, I'm in the seed business, you establish what I have to do, you set the standards, I comply, I help fund your meetings, right? We all get together for dinner, we give each other awards, and, you know, we try to grow the seed industry. And so I think that's one of the ways to think about what they're doing. And so they have this fairly close working relationship with the industry. They really don't have much of a contact with the farm community or with the gardening community, at least directly, though they would see them, those people, as the beneficiaries of their work, right? And well, I'm protecting you by making sure that the seeds that you buy, in fact, grow. And so when you think about this, and, you know, when they hear the word seed library, I think naturally they're going to think, well, geez, if it involves seeds, I got to be there, right? I'm the state seed official. You know, how's this happening without me either being aware of it, or, you know, how does this somehow relate to what I do? And it may be natural, and I'll explain a little bit more about this, that they would assume that it's probably within their jurisdiction until either somebody explains to them why it isn't, or they realize that, well, this really doesn't involve anything that is what I'm really worried about. And as you recognize, there are certainly some places in there where you can have differing reactions. You know, secondly, I think it's important to recognize that your model of seed distribution, you know, distributing seeds from seed libraries, isn't what they're used to dealing with. Right? They're not used to people giving things away. They're used to people creating businesses and coming up with better, improved products to make money, right? And to, you know, try to improve the quality of the genetic resources that are available to enhance yields. And so, to some extent, I think they may have trouble understanding what it is that you really do. You know, why would you do that? Okay, well, now I understand. Okay. And so this really then, I think it turns it to you. First is the issue of explaining what you do. And secondly, certainly then also, as Neil has talked about, an examination of the law to see if it really does apply to you, or if in fact you're either somehow exempted or you just don't fit into the definitions in the first place in terms of the gaps that are there. And again, as you're learning here, and certainly as I'm learning, you have various ways that you obtain your seeds. Growing them yourselves, getting them back from people who've grown out your seeds, getting donated commercial seed packets that are already have been through this process. And so, right, there may be different issues that might apply depending on which part of that you're involved in. But certainly as long as you're not involved in the commercial sale of seeds, which sounds like almost uniformly you aren't, you've jumped one of the major hurdles that is in part, you know, the regulatory hook that they have. Even with the Minnesota law saying it applies to the interpersonal trading of seeds between people, I think it would be interesting to see whether they in fact have the regulatory authority to prevent people. I mean, that would be telling people that you could prevent them from sharing a meal in a restaurant. Right? Well, I mean, the restaurant may want to charge you for splitting a plate, but I'm not sure that it somehow, you know, would violate a state law. But that's a different issue for now. You know, third, I think also to help you understand why they may in fact be resistant to a claim that you're somehow exempted, is you have to also think about the context that many state departments of agriculture may find themselves into. And that is that they, I believe, are facing what they would see as a series of efforts on the part of people to either claim that they're exempt or to carve out niches from their jurisdiction. And you can think about raw milk laws, which probably most of you from a state that may be having a fight over whether or not raw milk should be allowed to be sold, whether it should be subject to the State Department's jurisdiction and inspection. Food freedom laws, which have been proposed in a number of states that basically try to say that people should be able to sell anything that they raise on their farm or that they produce to consumers as long as they tell them this hasn't been subject to anybody's jurisdiction, anybody's inspection. Now in that situation, that actually involves a commercial carve-out, right, as opposed to some type of donative carve-out. And you also have cottage food exemptions, right, in which states are carving out areas where people need exemptions from food manufacturing law, as well as long as you don't sell more than $15,000 worth of muffins at the farmer's market, we're not going to make you have a certified food manufacturing licensed kitchen facility. And so I think, you know, if you put yourself in the room where your job was being a regulator, and you had this view that, well, what I'm doing is designed to protect the integrity of some piece of food safety, public commerce, and then people came in and said, yeah, but you really can't reach this part. Or what we're doing may involve your subject, but it really doesn't involve your law. You know, you naturally might say, well, I don't know, let me think about that, right? But then that's what creates the opportunity, I think, for you to, right, help respond to them. Certainly one of the questions is, what exactly is the risk, right? You don't necessarily threaten commerce. You aren't introducing noxious weeds. Hopefully you aren't introducing invasive species, right? You're not actually involved in consumer fraud or deception, right? And then giving out low germination seeds intentionally somehow. And so it's not clear that any of the risks apply. And in fact, I think it's worthwhile asking the question, well, so who in fact is threatened by this? I mean, if somebody in the industry, the trade isn't necessarily threatened. I mean, the people who may be most threatened are the regulators think, well, my gosh, you know, this is something that I should be able to somehow regulate, but people are telling me I can't. It's also important, I think, to remember that seed regulators are non-political and that these aren't necessarily partisan jobs. Though they, you know, they may well have their own organizations. But it's also important to remember that their bosses are political, right? Because most of these people, the commissioners, are appointed by the governors. In about 12 or 13 states now, the secretaries are still elected. And so these folks have a boss that's, right, subject to political pressure, political concerns. You heard John's comment about the Minnesota story, that after they got further into it, perhaps they came to wish maybe we hadn't kicked over, right, this subject. And I don't think that, you know, most elected officials necessarily want a political fight with the local library or with a group of librarians, right? Because you come to this debate with a fairly high moral standing and political impression. You know, it's a little bit like being the person who went out and closed down the kids' lemonade stand because they were in violation of the zoning law, right? It's doubtful that Dairy Queen asked them to do that for them, right? And so, in that fifth, that brings me to my final point, and I think that is the key to how the issue in your work can be portrayed in a positive light and in a non-threatening way. You know, a good rule of thumb, certainly one involving the law, is you don't pick a fight if you don't need to, or if a fight doesn't necessarily exist. And you know, that's a good rule of thumb in a lot of things. And so I think, you know, your efforts are, as I listen to them, I used to be the chair of the National Gardening Association. I chaired the Iowa Food Policy Council for then Governor Vilsack for 6 years. And I wrote the book, The Legal Guide for Direct Farm Marketing. Maybe some of you have that book if you've been involved in farmers markets. And so what I hear that you're about is really promoting gardening, promoting healthy food. You're promoting an appreciation for plants and an enjoyment of that work. Seeds are the medium to how you get there, but they're not really the focus of what you do, right? I mean, the seeds are the parallel to the books in your library. I mean, the books are the medium to knowledge and insight and enjoyment and recreation. You know, the state doesn't charge you sales tax because somebody consumed a book, right, that they borrowed from you and read. And so, you know, the idea that while it involves seeds, it's not really just the seeds, right? The seeds are this pathway to the other things that you're trying to promote in communities, which in fact are fairly powerful forces in terms of wellness and health. Every Secretary of Agriculture has an Ag in the Classroom Ag Awareness Program. I mean, they're all jacked up about the idea of trying to get people to know more about farming and know more about food. Well, that's what you're doing by helping people have access to seeds to be able to grow these things. That doesn't mean, right, and I don't mean to minimize the potential issues, because they certainly can be threatening. And when you look at a state law, none of you are sitting there thinking that I was a librarian, if I was going to go to jail, it was going to be over some access to information issue, not that I was trading seeds, right, and was prosecuted. But I think that the seed libraries, at least as I hear what you're doing, really reflect part of what's kind of the continuing evolution of how libraries do their work and serve the changing needs of communities. And when you view it in that way, I think it's possible for you to have as many allies in state government, particularly political allies, as you've certainly found in your own communities in terms of the support of your mayors and your city councils. So don't pick a fight if you don't need to. If somebody wants to pick a fight, then make sure that you actually understand and they understand what the law is and how it might apply to you. And if in fact you need a legal change, or as Gary has mentioned to you, we're going to have an opportunity in this program to develop a resolution to help bring out of this meeting and to look at allies to bring onto that, well then, that's a worthy exercise. So with that, I'll turn it over to our friend from the north.
Well, thank you, everybody. It's quite an honor to be here and to be sharing the panel with such distinguished fellows here. So maybe I'll start just by saying a little bit about who I am, and then I'll kind of move into my reaction and our collective reaction up in Canada about what was happening down here. And then we'll talk about a little bit about our own regulatory challenges. We have a new seed regime coming into play in the next year or so, so there's presents a lot of interesting questions. So I guess who am I? My name's Jacob, and I am some kind of community garden fundamentalist and guerrilla gardening extremist. And so a number of years ago, I attended a Seedy Saturday seed exchange, and I was blown away by all the purple carrots and purple beans and purple everything, and I filled up my bag like a kid at a candy store, and I emptied it out like after Halloween, and I went through it, and I decided I had to start a community garden. From there, every year it always came back to seeds, and we started a community seed bank, and then I learned about seed libraries. But I was studying social movements and social network analysis, so I was studying all these emergent global social movements and learning how people are responding to kind of the collapse of the commons, and how people are responding to global challenges like climate change and world hunger and poverty and inequality and the loss of democracy and corporate corruption. And so around the time of the Occupy movement, I thought to myself immediately, Occupy Gardens. And I went down to our park in our financial district in Toronto and had a little sign, Occupy Gardens, and started kind of recruiting some kind of militia of guerrilla gardeners to make a stand for food security. And on May 1st, 2012, we planted a free community food garden at our provincial legislature in Queen's Park. And we had the mainstream media digging in the dirt with us, live broadcasting across the city, and the Toronto Police Department looking on nervously. And the garden flourished for 5 months, and then on the eve of harvest, it was destroyed, uprooted by a dozen city workers who were ordered by the director of parks to come and destroy the garden. And I had a similar feeling at that time, the same feeling kind of that I had when I learned about the letter sent to the Pennsylvania librarians, when what you're doing has such a profound impact that it requires some kind of state intervention, because you can't just go around and start planting free community food gardens wherever you want. It would be anarchy and the whole system would fall apart. What's the logic at play? So our free community food garden that was growing rare seeds in this public park, that was engaging hundreds of people who had never gotten their hands dirty before. This was seen as a threat that elicited a response from the director of parks. And a dozen city workers had to come in without notifying the community to destroy this garden because of the precedent that it sets. And so we had images, and the story went fungal, as they say. So the next year we rallied 5 times as many people for a free food for all festival, and we actually served notice to the premier and invited her to join us in replanting this community food garden. They had just introduced a local food act, and the Premier appointed herself the Minister of Agriculture. And they did respond to our notice and demand. We had a human rights defender, and we kind of laid out our demands and our, the constitutional rights and all these right to food that we were calling for. And we had meetings with the legislative security in Queen's Park in the basement, and the Toronto Police Department notified us that they had been chatting with the media to kind of suppress any news media coverage of our event, just to try to dissuade us from replanting the People's Peas Garden that we had nicknamed it. But at that time, our guerrilla gardening collective, Occupy Gardens, we had been working with friends at the Toronto Tool Library and towards establishing the first tool library, and there they had a gardening section with rototillers and shovels and rakes, and that's where we got the idea of the seed library. And so we started rallying the urban agriculture movement in Toronto, which is quite extensive, and there's literally hundreds of organizations that are working on community food systems, and there's food centers, and we have these Seedy Saturday seed exchanges now that happen all around the city. And so we had an amazing support from the community, and so we launched the Toronto Seed Library. And with the support of this large collective in the city, we had our first event at Toronto Seedy Hall, and we had a seed-in the foyer. And we invited all of our Seedy councillors to join us, and we even sent an envoy of Seedy children up to our Seedy mayor's office, but as you might have heard, he was already engaged in other Seedy affairs. So yeah, so I come from a maybe more critical perspective on kind of what it is we're doing, and maybe I have a quote here actually from Ken Green. Each new seed library represents a new, radically decentralized approach to food security. Those at the vanguard of the movement recognize the revolutionary importance in their work. No one is demanding any transparency or accountability from the big seed companies. More and more, the only way we'll have any kind of seed sovereignty is by saving our own seeds and sharing them. Right? So, yeah, when I learned about the seed library concept, I was so excited, and I started Googling it, and I learned that there was a movement afoot. And I had become obsessed with studying movements, and so I was immediately drawn into that and very excited about the potential of the movement. At that time, there was maybe 100 or 200 seed libraries, and I thought that's quite a lot of seed libraries. And then it occurred to me that there's actually 99 public libraries just in the city of Toronto. And we have one of the largest public library systems probably in the world, and there's like 20 million users that come in and out of the system every year. And so, me walking around with a little bag of seeds, sharing seeds to people on the street or in the community, it's not really going to challenge these big seed companies. But if you were to integrate a seed library, a free public access seed catalog within 99 public libraries in the city, and anybody anywhere could go in and borrow those seeds and learn how to grow and save them, and then you're going to integrate that system within the community, and then eventually we would start challenging the monopolization of our seed supply from these big companies who in North America, they have a monopoly on the seed. Where in a lot of other places around the world, people are still kind of in control of their seeds, and they're not the ones looking for a fight. They're the ones, actively resisting the fight that's been brought to their doorsteps from these companies that are headquartered in our countries. And so we have we do a lot of solidarity work in our movement in Toronto. We have people from every country and diasporas that are coming and going, and so we get to hear a lot of stories about what people are dealing with in their own communities and countries, and it's sometimes pretty shocking to hear some of the stories of people in communities in resistance. And in particular, we've been inspired by Dr. Vandana Shiva, who comes frequently through Toronto and gives lectures to groups of hundreds and thousands of people, and hearing some of the stories that she's gathered and been involved with is quite profound. And so we really do see the revolutionary importance of our work and take it quite seriously. So when we heard that the seed libraries were starting to get letters from their state departments of agriculture, it kind of fit quite well within this narrative of how these companies conspire with states to fix the regulations and fix the laws to support their own ends, under the guise of supporting the prosperity and growth and jobs and well-being and all these things, where when most of us here know that our food system is in crisis, and there's about 1 billion people on the planet without access to healthy food, yet we produce an abundance and we throw away a huge portion of it. And so it's not necessarily a very good situation that we're experiencing. And we don't often have a lot of support from our leaders in business and government or our lawmakers in the work that we do, and so we have to be very creative and resourceful with the resources that we do have. I actually wanted to give this to Neil. It's our CD zine. We produce a community publication, and this is our summer edition, and our feature article was Seed Librarians equals Agri-Terrorists, which I think was part of the concern cited by, I'll just pass it over. I have Neil cited in there, so it's quite interesting. I wrote it in the summer immediately after hearing about it, and now to sit here with it, it's quite special.
Jacob, can you say a few words about the pending legislation in Canada and what it's looking like?
Yeah, so in Canada, our federal government, in Canada, our seed laws are regulated at the federal level. And so we just have the federal laws that govern the whole country. And, we have a conservative government right now that has a majority power, although they have minority support amongst the people. And so they've been working on, while they still have power, we have an election upcoming, they've been implementing all kinds of omnibus bills. So, some bills are hundreds of pages of legislation that cover dozens of different acts. And so one of those is the Agricultural Growth Act, or Bill C-18. And that is, it's about 110 pages of legislation that covers 9 different agriculture-related acts, including the Seeds Act and Plant Breeders' Rights Act. And so this essentially is extending plant breeders' rights and has kicked up quite resistance from the National Farmers Union in Canada, as well as the Canadian Biotech Action Network. But it's received scant media coverage. There's been very little to no debate publicly about what the bill is about, what's included in the bill. And so there's a lot of complexity surrounding the bill. A lot of the policymakers, the people voting on it, they don't even know what it means, really. They're just told by the biotech lobby that this is good for business, and business is good, so this bill is good. And so there's a lot of confusion amongst the community as to the implications of this new bill. And so it was just passed, I think, last number of months ago, and so they're just about to bring it into the implementation phase. And so essentially it updates Canada's agreement from UPOV 78 to UPOV 91, and this is like an international convention on plant breeders' rights. And so it's extending plant breeders' rights where it hadn't before to begin including vegetables and fruit varieties, as well as taking away the farmer's right to save seed. And so prior to that, farmers had the right to save seeds from these protected varieties on the farm for their own personal use. And in the future, that right has been taken away and it's become a privilege. And so the owners of these seeds can then go in and challenge the farmers if they're storing these protected varieties, basically so that the farmers have to go back and buy the seeds every year. And so that shifts the power from farmers and communities to develop their own varieties, and shifts that power into the hands of this multinational corporate state. So there hasn't been any direct threats or attacks on seed libraries in Canada, and we've had, I think proportionally, we have quite a number of seed libraries, and we have a lot of support, most of which exist in public libraries. And so there's a lot of kind of municipal support, and I think that's a really interesting angle to look at, to see how local governments and regional governments can support this work, because I think they have a really big role to play, as well as other public institutions like universities and colleges and community health centers. And so it is, we have a lot of public support, and so I personally can't see this legislation affecting it, and I can't see them trying to enforce it on us at this stage in the movement, because we've gotten so big, and a lot of people know what it is all about, the seed libraries, and there's a lot of concern around the GMOs, and millions against Monsanto and the marches and the demands for labeling that's taking place. So, but the question becomes when it's, you know, a couple seed libraries sharing a few seeds, but then what happens? Well, seed libraries tend to grow, right? And at what point does it start threatening or risking or presenting a risk to the commercial interests or the large-scale seed farmers? And we've had a lot of support from our local seed farmers who are in it as a mission to save seeds, and they make enough money to support themselves, but they're not interested in making, you know, a ton of profit from it. And so we've had a lot of support from the small-scale seed farmers, where at first we thought we may be in conflict with them by sharing seeds and undercutting their markets, but we found that we were actually increasing the markets. And we're improving the markets as more people begin to value seeds and local seeds, and they begin demanding, you know, higher quality seeds and start supporting the work of these local seed farmers. And so, yeah, that's just a question to put out there for folks. And how can we work with these seed farmers and seed companies in a way that's mutually beneficial so that it's not antagonistic and we can all grow together?
Any more questions for our panelists on legal issues? Yes.
This one back here.
Gail.
So, people sort of categorize, there can be a fuzzy line between, in the category of plants, between food and medicinal, traditional medicine plants. And as we know that food is a way that culture can reproduce itself and maintain an identity, do you foresee that thin line between medicinal, particularly with our growing laws here in this country, for some medicinal plants? Do you see a graying line or a fuzzy line between, or do you see a point at which traditional medicine plants, which are also very tied to cultural identity, fall under all these regulations? Was that a
Start.
good question?
Sure. Yeah.
Go ahead, ma'am.
Did everybody hear the question? The question is around whether or not medicinal plants would fall under the same regime. And for excuse me, for all the seed laws that I've read so far, there's no distinguishing between types of seeds. Within the law, it does distinguish what are the requirements for each seed. So usually the categories are agricultural seed, vegetable seeds, and flower seeds. And I guess the short answer is I don't think that there's a different regime for medicinal plants. I think they would fall under this if they were used through a seed library or shared through a seed library. It wouldn't matter what the end use of the plant is. If the seeds are used and are shared to grow for planting, then they would be subject, according to some states' interpretation, it would be subject to these laws. Anybody else?
Just to decide on that, a lot of the urban plants are considered invasive species. They're not invasive. I mean, they may be endemic to the area, but they spread like crazy. Obnoxious weeds. That's what that's about.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I had a conversation with Steve Malone in Minnesota, and that was something that he brought up. Well, who's to say what is a food crop to me versus you? And if it's a food crop to a particular community, but it happens to be a noxious weed in the cornfield, then that's a trickier scenario. But part of this is to be inclusive of all plants that are grown for a variety of uses. And so I think we need to address that. It hasn't come up necessarily in this particular scenario yet, but going forward, that is something definitely to consider.
Let me just give a quick answer to your question back about medicinal plants. I mean, if your concern is that they're somehow going to be subject to being patented, I mean, if these plants exist and their uses have existed, for example, you can find echinacea in any number of different products. Nobody owns echinacea, right? People use it, can distill it, right, include it in their ingredient. The process of trying to somehow identify what the active ingredient is from a chemical standpoint and then trying to file a patent on that, that's going to depend on how the patent officials interpret the standards of what makes something patentable, whether it's known, obvious, what the inventive step is. Clearly, the making available patent protections to things that are living materials that were formerly not considered to be subject to patents, raises some issues. But in fact, there also have been several patent disputes where patents have been granted and then unwound because what they were trying to patent really wasn't something that they discovered and was held not to be patentable. I don't know whether that helps or further confuses it, but the fact that they're plants and the fact they're not food crops doesn't necessarily make a distinction in terms of how intellectual property rights might apply. It's more a question of your somehow ability to say that I'm the one that invented this, right? Identified it, distilled it, did something different to it. And for most plants, that's not possible, particularly ones that have been traditionally used. There are many other questions. So.
Yes.
Along those lines, could you talk a little bit about how the Plant Variety Protection Act and PVP varieties are going to impact seed libraries, kind of regulatory, what we're going to be facing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll pass it over to you in a minute. So, that's a question that's come up a lot from the Department of Ag, because they've been concerned about, going back to who the constituency is for the Departments of Ag, and that's a question that the seed industry has asked about whether or not seed libraries are going to, how seed libraries will interact with that. For the most part, PVP varieties have to be labeled on the packet. So if you're a seed library getting seed donated from a seed company, you'll know if it's plant variety protected by seeing it on the packet. For the most part, probably most of the seed packets that seed libraries get donated are not PVP varieties. And so it's not a concern for seed libraries to infringe on PVP certificates. It is a concern where with some legislatures wanting to include that language in exemptions that we've proposed, to specify that seed libraries and other seed sharing activities cannot use PVP varieties. And while that may alleviate their own concerns, it actually doesn't add anything to the existing enforcement regime, because the PVP Act as a federal law applies outside and above and beyond, going back to the idea of preemption, outside and above the fact that what the state seed law says. So that's been something that's come up, and we've pushed back to say, well, that we don't need to add that in as another layer of protection. It already exists. I don't think Plant Variety Protection Act is going to pose a barrier to seed libraries, as long as seed libraries are careful about the seeds that they get donated, and then just keep updated with whether or not those seeds are protected.
It's important to recognize that the local heirlooms or things that you're getting from people aren't going to be subject to the PVPA, right? I mean, nobody's claimed a variety protection on them. The important distinction to remember when it comes to intellectual property rights and seeds as relate to plant variety protection certificates and utility patents are that plant variety protected plants have exceptions both for farmers to save seeds and to replant them, and for breeders to be able to have access to them to use in their breeding programs. Patents don't include either, right? You can't replicate somebody's, right? Every time you open a software package and use a new program, you've agreed to the bag tag that says, I'm not going to replicate this, right? Or otherwise I'm violating the patent. You also don't have the right to take it and to engineer it and, right, to do something additional with it without having some type of right from the patent holder. If it's a plant variety protected, right, variety, in fact, breeders can do that. I can take your variety, use it in my research program, and as long as I can make a new distinct variety based on top of it, I don't have to get your approval, I don't have to pay you royalties for it. If you're a farmer and you're buying PV protected things, you can save them and reuse them, and depending on the law you're in, maybe even have limited amounts of sales to other farmers similarly situated. That was the brown bagging exemption, but it has in large part disappeared. But
yeah, we discovered a PVP variety in our collection about a year ago. We weren't really aware that it was there, and once we found out, we We returned it to its source, which was in Germany. Basically, our mission is collect, distribute, share, and if we can't share it and distribute it, then we don't want it in our collection. So.
Yes, Bill.
Just a quick question, follow-up then. What's to prevent me from going into a library that has a PVP packet and saying, I want to use this for my own breeding purposes, and therefore I'm exempt from any sort of restriction? I mean, is that, am I hearing what you're saying about the law correctly? Or does it can't be exchanged, you know, take precedent over that?
Well, it'd be cleaner if you just bought it from wherever it was coming from,
Well,
because
yeah,
I mean,
right.
it obviously moved into
Right.
commerce for the library to be able to
Okay.
get it,
Right.
And if you're a plant breeder, anything that you can acquire that
Right.
is PVPA protected, in fact, can be used in your own breeding program.
Okay.
You know, throwing the library in, you know, that raises the issue of why the library was, you know, further handling PV protected
Okay.
varieties.
So as legal counsel, you're just saying it's cleaner and better for the libraries not to handle that material and get caught up in it?
I would think Neil would probably agree with that, yeah.
Okay, that's, I just wanted clarity.
Yeah.
It was stated that the seed control officials are going to have a panel on this issue in July. I'd like to know if anyone from this group has been invited to speak on that panel, or if we are going to initiate that conversation to make sure our voices were heard.
Yeah.
I think the latter for sure.
Has anybody? I haven't. I have not been invited. I don't know actually who's going to be on that panel, but I'm planning on finding out. And if possible, attending myself. I think part of the discussion that I'd like to have over the next day or two is to talk with folks around how we can build a broad base of support that we can communicate to that association from the seed library community from here, but in addition from maybe, you know, Organic Seed Alliance and the sort of organic seed breeders industry, and from academics who are plant breeders themselves, who support seed libraries, a number of who I've talked to, but to have sort of a broader spectrum of people supporting this, because I think that's what it's going to take to be able to convince the association to not take action further in this direction, and to maybe even turn the ship to supporting seed libraries. And I would be remiss if I didn't shout out Betsy, who I worked with in Nebraska to introduce legislation. So yes, please give her a round of applause.
We probably have time for one more question if there is one. Yes.
I'm curious about a lot of the regulatory stuff that you guys are talking about. It feels a lot like we're trying to respond to things that are happening and just keeping ourselves safe so that we can do what we're doing and not getting shut down. But in working and running seed libraries, I hear a lot of concern from the public about the general direction of seed regulation and the way that things are going, being very much away from seed in the public domain towards more privatization of seed genetics and corporate control of seed. I guess I hear a lot from the public concerns about that, and I'm curious if there's things that we can be doing as a movement, not just to protect ourselves, but to be advocating for new directions. And I hear it in some of what you're saying, but I'm curious if you had any kind of concluding sort of directions for us to think about it. And when we're communicating with the public, what can we be doing to be promoting regulation to keep seed in the public domain and really getting the word out about that?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that, and I hope maybe everybody might have something to share on this. I'll just start since the mic's in my hand. And I'm really glad that you mentioned the idea of this being a movement, and I've said that before, and we've heard that already. But I think something that is something to keep in mind is that calling the seed library, what's happening with seed libraries, a movement is one thing when there's more seed libraries growing, but there's something inherently political about the word movement. And so that's kind of the opportunity that I see with seed libraries. It's not just about, you know, building local food systems, although that is the direct mission of seed libraries, but it's an entree for people not just into growing their own food, but also into democracy and into taking control over your own food system, and communicating that with people who are elected or appointed to share that perspective on seeing seeds as a common heritage that we've inherited, and to be stewarded as that. There is this huge consolidation and narrowing in the diversity of seeds over time in the last 100 years. We saw that in the movie, and so many people are doing different things, large and small, to kind of point a direction to a different future. And so I really encourage seed libraries and people who are involved with them to be politically more active as well. You don't have to be a lawyer to make policy. You can be a seed librarian or a farmer, and you can make policy, and you can advocate and organize your community to do that. So I think that's the sort of positive light that I see seed libraries offer for people, not just to grow their own food, but also to grow more democracy.
I think that one very powerful concept is the commons idea, and the idea of the global common resource, not just as it pertains to seeds and to food crops, but that's a wonderful example, but as it pertains to water and other basic resources too. And to be able to actively espouse that idea moves the discussion into another sphere, instead of just responding, as you pointed out. And I look at the intellectual property rights debate, and is the better response to say, all these people have patents, our goal is to be able to get our own patent. That has been called using the maker's tools. Or is it to present an alternative concept, which is, in the case of seeds, that they have been developed over eons by human beings and have moved around the globe and are an end product that doesn't belong to anyone, but is a global common resource.
I think we're being asked to move on, but
I think so.
The Seed Savers is 40 years old. Started with 2 seeds, a handful of people. We had 13,000 members, 50 states, 30 countries. We have a collection of over 25,000 varieties. So we're now entering, I think, phase 2 of the seed movement, if you will. 40 years ago, no one knew what an heirloom was, and now people pay extra money to have heirloom food on the table. So, and you're not alone. It's not just seed libraries. There's a tremendous amount of activity out there with small little seed banks, little groups of people that are getting together to form their own regional local seed collection, and Native American groups that are rediscovering their cultural seeds that are so much a part of their, not just their food systems, but their health and their culture. And so I really feel that there's an energy that's beyond just seed libraries, but that's part of it. And I think so often too, the seeds gets defined in the whole debate about GMOs, and I think we have to set our own course as far as what do we want, 10, 20 years from now. How are we going to dictate the terms of the discussion? Quite frankly, I don't respond very often to media requests about GMOs, because that's not where we are. Seed Savers is the anti-GMO. This is we are in the public domain, protecting seeds. So I think we have to get that kind of mindset going forward.
Yeah, I appreciate Neil's reference to the idea of food democracy and seeing what you're doing as part of a movement. I've written a number of articles on the themes of food democracy. But just, as a word of caution, I think you realize that you have to pick your own fights and do what you do, and do what you do well. And as librarians, I would think in this regard, part of the opportunity is in fact to provide information to connect people with the groups like Seed Savers and others that are doing this work. You all live in some type of municipal political environment with your own funding and your own issues. And I'd hate to see, you know, a seed library get into trouble because they somehow became, right, politicized, that we were somehow, right, engaged in this movement that was going to bring down the corporatization of America's seed industry. You know, as important as issues like that may be, I don't know that they're necessarily your fight. They're a fight that you can help people who might be interested in that fight engage in. But, you know, I think as librarians and what you represent in terms of really an arm of municipal government in many situations, you know, I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, right, as to the environment that you probably all live in terms of your workplace.
Great, yeah, I second all of that. I just wanted to mention also look into the open source seed initiative if you haven't already. And also there's, in response to the Bill C-18 in Canada, the National Farmers Union there put out a Seeds Act for Farmers, which is kind of the voice of the movement, kind of, and proposing our own. And also kind of in a strategic sense, there are these marches against Monsanto that happen now in pretty much every major city, I would guess, across the continent. And we've been working with them, the March Against Monsanto, the Millions Against, to provide kind of a walk for something. So to shift this narrative from, you know, always in opposition to going against something and actually putting forth a vision of an alternative that people can actually see and participate in. That's friendly and accessible and fun.
Okay. Great. Thank you.